Then in that case, I have to do the obligatory thing that one does on rainy evenings, which is to thank you all for coming out, especially on such a rainy evening. So you came out for a good reason, and that's to hear Duncan White talk about writing and publishing and different kinds of publishing and just experiences at Oxford and Cambridge and Wellesley and Harvard. So Duncan researches and writes about American and European literature of the 20th century with an especial focus on the Cold War. And he's currently writing a book called Cold Warriors, a book about writers on both sides of the Iron Curtain that will be published by HarperCollins in the United States and Little Brown in the United Kingdom. Cold Warriors follows a number of writers, including Graham Greene, Jean Le Carré, Mary McCarthy, George Orwell, Andrei Sinyavsky, Stephen Spender, and Richard Wright through the various struggles surrounding the Cold War. He is also, his first book, Nabokov and His Books, Between Late Modernism and the Literary Marketplace, is also in production with Oxford University Press, so with an academic press, and will be published in March 2017. As an undergraduate, Duncan studied English at Cambridge before taking a master's in Russian and Eastern European literature at University College London, and he completed his DPhil in English at Oxford, writing a thesis on Nabokov. And after 4 years working as a sports reporter for the Sunday Telegraph in London, he moved here and he worked at my alma mater, Wellesley. And in addition to teaching and doing research, Duncan is a literary critic for the Daily Telegraph, where he reviews contemporary fiction, literary biographies, and anything to do with the Cold War. And I've read his reviews, and they're actually very witty, and they're good.
Yeah, you're the one.
Yeah. So thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks especially to Duncan for coming. And so this is just going to be kind of exploratory, and we're going to talk for a while, and then we'll have question and answers. So the first question is pretty basic. Just were there early experiences with writing that shaped who you are today?
I guess. Well, thanks for the lovely introduction. I came out of 3 years of being an undergraduate at Cambridge as a truly terrible writer. I was hopelessly florid, way too many adjectives. I really thought that, using Roget's thesaurus was the kind of way to really persuade people that I was a sophisticated writer. And after about a year of basically being unemployed, I got a journalistic job, and I was working with these copy editors who I mean, we call them sub-editors in the UK, but copy editors here, who I kind of felt superior to because a lot of them actually hadn't even been to university, and I had been to Cambridge, and I felt like, here we go, I'm the big shot coming in to do some flashy writing. This was sports writing, and they just picked me to pieces. They absolutely, pulled my writing apart, and it was the best thing that happened to me. I got more education about writing there than really I'd got in 4 years at Cambridge. Having said that, there were some excellent tutors that I'd had as an undergraduate who really kind of helped me almost with their impatience about my writing, to kind of get towards a place where I was starting to write a little bit better. But it was the journalistic experience that made me a better writer, and I took that into grad school. And then at grad school, I never had a problem. But undergraduate, I was hopeless. Absolutely.
So thus far, 3 themes are emerging: hopelessness and being terrible, and the value of impatience and being ripped apart in teaching, and that all these are inevitable and are good things in writing. Could you talk a little bit more about being picked apart by the people at the newspaper relative to the impatience of your tutors?
Well, the guy that was impatient got fired
Oh.
the following year. But I remember I'd written a paper for him, and I'd used quote, which I assumed was a noun, but he insisted was only a verb, as a noun, like on 3 consecutive pages. In the first page, he'd quite patiently written, "You mean quotation?"
Yeah.
Second page, crossed out, "You mean quotation?" Third page, he'd actually torn the paper.
Wow.
He was so furious.
That's intense.
But he was like, this was this kind of old school, like pseudo-Victorian,
yeah,
exactly, kind of stuff. And I don't think in other aspects of his teaching he wasn't a pleasant person to be taught by. But what I felt sometimes was that the impatience of my teachers at undergraduate level was never actually. It wasn't always very constructive. It was just a kind of, often it was a sign of their sort of being superior to me, and they didn't actually help me that much to become a better writer sometimes. Whereas when I was a journalist, even though it sometimes felt like a humiliation, it actually made me a better writer. And I think I mentioned this to you the other day, but there's one exercise where a sub-editor sat me down and he wrote down some words on a piece of paper. He wrote down, "Fresh fish on sale here today." And he put it down in front of me and he said, "Okay, what's wrong with this sign? This is a sign outside of Fishmonger in town. What's wrong with this sign?" And I looked at it and it was all spelt correctly. And I looked at it some more and I was like, "I just don't know." He said, "Well, if you could get rid of one of those." I said, "Oh, well, maybe today, because, it is today." And he's like, "Right." And then he just went through and he said, "Well, would you sell fish that wasn't fresh?" "No." So he got rid of that. On sale, it's a shop, that, got rid of that. And eventually he just ended up with fish. And he was like, "This is what I do with your prose every day. You just decorate it with all this stuff, and it's getting in the way of the information you're trying to get across." And so I do a very gentle version of that when I teach my students now about writing, about kind of knowing when the adjective needs to be there to be really punchy, and most sentences just need to do a job.
Flannery O'Connor says writing can't be taught, but you can teach people what not to write. And it sounds as though you had a bit of a negative education in writing.
To a degree, and I'm not. I really strongly believe it's a craft. I really strongly believe you can get better. I think there are maybe limits to how much better you can get, or some people just enjoy it more than others. But I really do think it's a craft. I really do think with good teaching you can become a better writer. Yeah.
And a lot of it is reducing what people are doing with thesauruses and et cetera.
Yeah, it's a lot of. There's a lot of. I don't know. I feel like I spend a lot. When I have taught writing in the past, I spent a lot of time helping students kind of unlearn what they've been taught at high school, because at high school you necessarily get taught a kind of a way that has to be kind of reproducible and has to be from a template, because you're teaching like 25 students or whatever in your class.
Right.
So you need to be able to do that. But then as you get kind of more nuanced and sophisticated, I think you need to kind of unlearn that a little bit, and those skills are things you can fall back on, but you need to make that jump as a writer, certainly at an undergraduate level.
I think approaching it as a practice, as an art, as a craft, akin to cooking or something like that, is desirable. There's actually a recipe for spaghetti sauce that involves just cooking wine, and you can use the wine to reduce the sauce, and so you're just boiling basically some of it off. And I always think of my writing as, first I throw everything in one place, and then I try and do this reduction, where just getting it down to its essentials.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess one of the things being a journalist taught me was, so I had to write, when I was a staff writer, which was after I'd finished my PhD, I was a staff writer for 4 years, and I had to produce maybe, 3,000 words of publishable prose a week.
Wow.
And I couldn't even afford the luxury of being able to do that, really. I just had to be able to churn out sentences.
Crank it out. Yes.
And often, forgive me you guys don't really like sport, but one of my main jobs was on a Saturday afternoon, I would go to a football match, a soccer match, and I would report on it, and I'd report on it live. And that meant that when the final whistle went, I had like maybe 5-10 minutes to get my copy across. And my copy was normally 1,000 words, like between 800 and 1,000 words. So I had to, like, if anything happened in the last 5-10 minutes of a football match, which often does, I had to change everything and I had to rewrite and get 1,000 words across. And I did that every week for 4 years. And that just like completely like de-blocked me as a writer. I never have had a problem getting words on the page since. What actually I had to do when I came back into an academic setting was kind of relearn a bit of patience and relearn, like, you know, taking my time over stuff and the fact that I could, you know, revise things. Because being able to write 1,000 words in well, you know, half an hour was
I'm going to try that with undergraduates.
Match reporting.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And just forcing a certain rate of production just in terms of quantity can be incredibly effective, and it also can short circuit self-censorship mechanisms.
Yeah, and it's weird because I've now, now when I go back to journalism, it takes me forever to write a book review, forever. I mean, I get so frustrated with myself because it takes so long compared to what, you know, the journalism that I used to do before, because it was sport and it was fairly straightforward. But still, you know, it took me, I don't know how many years to do the Nabokov book. I mean, 4 years maybe. So getting used to that's the biggest challenge I found, is getting used to the different pacing of writing for different audiences, and being okay with that yourself is very difficult. Like, and finding the boundaries of so with book reviews, I sometimes feel like, well, I'm more likely to be read by my friends from grad school than I am the people that used to read my football reports. So am I kind of writing for this kind of audience that's halfway in between? What if it's too facile for my, you know, my peers? You know, am I kind of putting something out there that I'm going to feel like it's been sort of knocked off in too quick a time, sort of hack work, basically. So I end up totally overcompensating and taking too long over that. But this is, you know, it's the kind of the pragmatics of writing for different audiences that are the things you have to negotiate with yourself, how best you're going to deal with them.
How did you make the transition from being a sports journalist to writing 2 books for 2 completely different audiences?
Well, I mean, the Nabokov book was a version of my PhD. I like to think a much better version of my incredibly shit PhD.
What was better about it?
I rewrote the whole thing. It was awful.
I want to hear more about what kinds of shifts that you made. Like, what can make a dissertation better? Because that is something that really matters to people.
Okay, so my dissertation was good enough to pass a Viva. It was good enough to pass a defence, it's in the UK you do kind of 3 years of work on your PhD and then you're done. And mine took 4, but it was like getting my driving license to become someone who had a PhD. It really felt like that. It was something that, you know, no one's kind of proud of the way they drove when they did the driving test, right? It's just like you kind of did everything right in order to make sure you passed the test. So I like footnoted diligently, and I, you know, made a kind of slightly lame argument that they said, okay, I guess, and then and then I got past, and then I said, well, you know, what I wish I could have done would have been this, and I just read more, and I read other books, and I thought, actually, I kind of want to write a book that I want to read, and I was so fed up with my dissertation that I just rewrote it completely, and it got better.
Was it about being free of the shackles of the committee, or was it intellectual maturation, or some combination of those factors, or something else?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I was fortunate, I didn't have a committee. You just have one supervisor.
Oh, how lovely.
And he was he was entirely hands off. So hands off actually that he moved to Sydney
Oh,
for the
wow.
last year of my PhD,
Yeah.
which was, and I sort of barely noticed the change.
Uh-huh.
But but he was great. He was fantastic. He just let me run with it. But no, I just kind of grew up intellectually.
Yeah.
I was just a late
Yeah.
developer, and I also I was doing a PhD on a very narrowly focused topic, Nabokov, who himself invites certain kind of, I don't know, obsessive reading. So you can kind of get, and there's a whole little community, and I was part of that community, and I'd organised a conference and all this stuff. And I suddenly realised, like, oh no, this is, I've got to have a professional existence outside of, you know, what
These
essentially
10
is like,
people.
this kind of weird hobbyist community that I've fallen into. And so I actually had to sort of start thinking a bit bigger, and that was fine. That helps, and it just also there was I would be lying if I didn't say there was a degree of kind of sitting like, well, this dissertation isn't going to get me a job. I need to make it into something that more people are going to want to read, that seems more relevant. So yeah.
This is a little off the beaten path, but it sounds like it's not an accident that you chose Nabokov to write about.
No, I mean, in terms of
his capability at writing in different voices.
I mean, I wouldn't compare myself to him as a writer.
Yeah.
But I was always kind of into him from when I was an undergrad, and I wasn't allowed when I was at Cambridge to write about him because he wasn't British, and so I was doing an English degree, and so I wrote about Joseph Conrad to prove a point. And then I had to sort of, I just wasn't done with it. It was and so I hadn't been allowed to do this. I'd wasted my undergraduate career, really. I just didn't feel I had emerged with as much as I wanted to. And so when I came back, it sort of seemed right that I would go back to this figure who was, you know, who I found very, you know, fascinating, and I do love reading his books.
At what age did he start learning English?
Oh, about 3 or 4.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
he was a little kid.
Whenever I work with people who write in English as a second language, I often mention Nabokov and Conrad, of course. And Conrad learned quite late, and from sailors. He started when he was 18 or something. And so it's just an example. You can still be one of the world's great English prose stylists, even if you learn English from sailors on a boat when you're 18.
Yeah. I mean, there is, and it has been pointed out to me in the past, I grew up living in continental Europe, and as a little kid I spoke better German than I spoke English. I went to German, like, public school, and so I had to, when I finally ended up at a British school in Brussels, I had to take remedial English classes with all the other kids that had come from different countries. So I had to sort of learn my own language formally in a way. So maybe I did gravitate a little bit towards writers like Conrad and Nabokov for that reason, the idea that you're kind of slightly in between linguistic categories. But yeah.
Well, it probably also has something to do with literary modernism and the idea of when you're writing in multiple languages, it's more likely that some of them are going to have that quality of unfamiliarity. And I always choose to interpret my incompetence in writing in other languages to the idea that I'm making it new. And
right.
yes. So what about the trade book? How did that happen? Do you have an agent?
Yes.
Yeah. How did all that happen? Tell us the story.
So one of the benefits of doing, or what I now see as a benefit of doing kind of public writing, doing book reviews and things like that, was that it introduced me to a world in which people wrote books that people were going to read, and they got paid for that.
Wow.
And I'd spent like
that's alien to everyone.
I spent 4 years working on a book that not even my parents are going to read, and it suddenly seemed very appealing. But it was also slightly born out of, I feel like I keep sort of talking about everything being a disaster, but it was actually born slightly out of a disaster. I'd lost an adjunct professorship job that I thought I was going to get. I was coming out the back of a research fellowship at Wellesley. I had a kind of academic Cold War book in the works. And suddenly I was a substitute teacher in the middle school system in Lexington.
Wow.
I had 3 degrees. I was writing book reviews in the UK that may or may not have been doing okay. It was hard to tell from this far away, but I just felt kind of, I needed to change something. And so I began to put together a sort of a pitch for a trade book, and off the back of some of the reviews I'd done, which had been slightly more essayistic and had been about the Cold War, and I got in touch with a few agents, and some of them said, "You're an academic. This sounds academic.
Go away.
Go to an academic press."
Yes.
And that was fine. And then I got in touch with an agent that I'd actually been in touch with years previously about a completely different idea. And I said to him, like, do you know any agents that'd be interested? And he said, well, I am. So, and I worked with him for almost a year on the pitch, on getting the proposal right. And then the scary thing about doing trade books is they go to market and within 2 weeks whether it's happening or not.
Wow.
So it goes out, they send out your proposal to the major publishing houses. There aren't that many of them. And if you get picked up, by the end of the week. Or 2 weeks. In America, in the States it was a week, in the UK it was 2 weeks, yeah.
So it's the opposite of academic time.
Opposite. And then they have a really hard deadline that they keep you to.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. It's like scaring me at
as
the
you
moment.
wince.
As I think about this, I know
Yeah.
how little I've done of the book. But yes, in theory, it's good.
Given that you had previously written on the Cold War from an academic perspective, when you were imagining a book for a broader audience, did you have some sort of rule of thumb or rubric that helped you to think, well, what does a general reader actually read?
Yes. So I guess I had some interlocutors. You have other people that you're working with. So I had my agent who, wants the book to sell, doesn't really care about my intellectual pretensions. But is also, well, he does, but the other thing he said to me, which was great, is like, again, this idea of like getting a license to practice, like get your PhD in order to be able to have an academic job in theory. And get a book contract in order to be able to write a book. To get a book contract, you have to you have to perform. You have to sort of make like this is. You go into the Harvard bookstore. There's a lot of books which might as well be academic books. They're pretty dry, and but I'm sure when they were pitched, it was super exciting. It sounded like, So there's this gatekeeping part that he helped usher me through. But in general, I mean, I don't know. Luke Menand in the English department always talks about how he's kind of, not quite scholarly enough for an academic press, but not quite, kind of popular enough to reach a larger audience. And he doesn't know why that is. That's just how he is, and he just writes like that. I don't entirely believe him, but I do think there is like this kind of sort of sweet spot where you don't actually have to write that differently to the way you're writing academics. Some of the framework disappears, some of the pressures disappear. Like you don't have to make an argument the whole time when you're writing for a larger audience. Sometimes people don't necessarily want you badgering them about something. But that sometimes feels almost like cheating when you're just writing kind of narrative prose. But at the same time, going back and writing academic prose can really be stimulated by the idea of just like communicating clearly with your audience. And sometimes we get so lost. I mean, I read some of my dissertation and it was like I was deliberately trying to hide what I wanted to say because I was kind of embarrassed that it wasn't really the case. And and I don't know, there's I could talk for ages about like academic difficulty and all that sort of stuff, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with people's terror of, I don't know, post-structuralism or like the idea of kind of really difficult theoretical works, which are kind of difficult for a really important reason, but that doesn't mean you're kind of, your writing about this stuff has to be.
Exactly. So you spoke about having interlocutors in terms of other people with whom you spoke. What about interlocutors in terms of books that you read where you said, oh, well, that's really an attractive model, you know, I would like to write like that, or that you're somehow in conversation with books that have already been written?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to sound a bit like a fanboy now, but Luc Menand's work is actually something that I do kind of admire. Like the writing he does for the New Yorker, this kind of historicist approach that kind of doesn't necessarily pin its colours to the mast in a way, you know, it kind of appeals to me. But yes, that kind of writing I really like. I mean, book reviews I think should be funny and should be entertaining, because otherwise why read them? I think academic prose should be clear, and there's tons of people that write about really complicated and difficult things in my field. Mark McGurl is someone who I think is absolutely fantastic, who writes about post-war American fiction in a really sophisticated way that, you know, you have no problem assimilating.
This fall, in an idle moment, I was reading a review of a book about Wallace Stevens. It was either in Times Literary Supplement or a London Review of Books, and it was superbly written. And I thought, talk about being a fanboy slash fangirl, I thought, I'm going to write this person a letter. So I found out where he taught, and I just wrote a little email saying, I've read a lot of book reviews and reviews of Wallace Stevens, in fact, and yours is one of the best that I've read. And not only did he write back, he sent me a present, which was a beautifully translated book that he had translated by Joseph Roth. And so I really got a reward out of this.
Who was it?
Michael Hoffman.
Michael Hoffman. Yeah. I thought it might be him because he translates Roth. Yeah.
Well, it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had. Have you ever done anything like that?
He writes some of the most aggressive hatchet jobs ever, right? He's like...
Yeah.
Who did he absolutely savaged some Central European
They're
writers,
kind of lapidary.
He's good. He's great.
Yeah. It's very hard to know when to get the axe out.
Yeah.
And particularly if you tend toward understatement and, you know, the modest and that kind of thing. But every once in a while, aren't you tempted to take
I do, but it's really once in a while. I think
Yeah.
you can see the reviewers, the book reviewers that come onto the scene and try and make a name for themselves by just kind of trashing it.
Well, that's horrible.
Do you know Dale Peck? Do you remember Dale Peck?
Yeah.
That was his whole shtick was like, I'm going to trash everything.
It's very easy to trash things.
Yeah, and I also, and I think that's something I used to review sports books for an obscure magazine, and I used to trash the hell out of these books. I was really like snobby 21-year-old. And I was at a drinks reception about 10 years later, and a big Scottish guy, pinned me up against the wall, and he was like, use Duncan weight. And I was like, yes. I was figuring at this stage he might not be a fan. And he just went in, and I'd apparently been really mean about his book that he'd written years previously as a snotty 21-year-old. And I couldn't even remember doing it. And it was just this awful. And at the time, I actually felt really bad. And it took me quite a long time to actually get this, to sort of deal with this situation, because he was a sort of, you know, colleague of a colleague or whatever. But it was the sort of thing I could do when I was 21. But I know how hard it is to write those many words in a row. And I know how bad it is when I do it. So why not be a little bit more forgiving of other people and think about what they're doing productively, especially when, for whatever reason, a number of my cohort at Oxford all ended up being kind of people who write about books in like journals and magazines and newspapers. And so we'd had this discussion a lot in recent years. And, you know, some people will bring up Orwell and say, you've got to hold your generation to account, and you have to, you know, you are the person that has to kind of hold high standards, and it's impersonal, and you've got to do this. And I really understand, and I'm sympathetic to that to a degree. I also think that, you know, we live in a world where literature really has to fight its corner in a way that it didn't when in Orwell's days. In Orwell's days, literature was just a given. It was in more than a given. It was something that was kind of aspired to, and in a way that it isn't anymore, I don't think. And so part of what we do is actually sometimes evangelize and try and get people out reading good books and ensuring that creative writers get new contracts to write new books and try and create some sort of enthusiasm. So generally positive. But then, you know, every now and again, something egregious comes across, and then you just feel like the shackles are off and you can really go for it.
It's funny, I had to write something today, and I had received a text message asking me to write this thing, and I was actually asked that the title of the text was "Be Tough," and I wrote back and I said, you know, I can be tough, but I'm not going to, you know, rip this person apart, and there's nothing to be gained by hurting other people's feelings.
Yeah.
And the person who is paying me to write this thing wrote back and said, other people's feelings have nothing to do with it. But then you know what? I ended up writing something nice because, because what was the point? And I actually think other people's feelings always have something to do with it. And it's, if you're writing something about another human being's stuff and you would be ashamed to say it to their face, then
it becomes an issue of, like, when I write, I'm very conscious of the difference between writing reviews of creative, you know, of writing reviews of fiction and writing reviews of non-fiction, because you can't really be a chancer when you write a novel. You know, I mean, and if you do, then it's probably not going to get published. Whereas non-fiction, you can really be a chancer. You can just do a cuttings job of someone's, but you can just, there are loads of shortcuts to making kind of easy money in publishing through writing non-fiction. And you can, and when people do that, you can do a number of them. And also then there's like really celebrated writers who kind of indulge huge vanity projects. I reviewed Jonathan Franzen's translation of Karl Kraus recently, and it was just, there were footnotes about his sex life in his 20s in Germany, and I was just like, right, I'm not having this.
Well, that's just, you know, avert your gaze. That's embarrassing. It was a little embarrassing. And one of the things that you've indicated so far is that your reading habits and reading practices are really intimately related to the way that you understand yourself as a writer. And I wonder if you've said some self-critical things about your own writing that suggests that you've gone back and read it with a willingness to sort of, you know, beat yourself up, for lack of a better phrase. How useful do you think reading your own work with that kind of a critical eye is? Because I find it hugely useful. I read my own work incessantly, which sounds narcissistic, but I'm actually trying to, like, discipline it.
I never revised essays when I used to think of, I used to sort of, it's gone, it can't come back. Like, and I'll style it out when it comes to the tutorial. And I was a bit like that with filing copy as well. Just click send and let it go, and, you know, don't check Twitter in the morning and you'll be fine. But it is, I think it's absolutely essential to read your own work and have a sense of yourself as a writer, and actually have a sense of what you do that isn't that great. And so when I publish a book, when I publish a book review now, I now try and look at what other people have done, how other people have reviewed the book, and how it was better than mine, and try and kind of learn from them, as well as looking at my own stuff and thinking about whether it's okay or not, or what might have worked and what didn't. And again, what you have when you write public prose generally is that you have public prose, it sounds pretentious, but like when you write book reviews, you're working with an editor and you have that immediate sounding board, and they tend to cut your lame jokes and your excesses and very quietly kind of make some changes. Sometimes I look at my piece and I realise that some cuts have happened and they've not even consulted me on that. And
that's a real editor.
That's a real.
Yeah,
that's
sneaky.
actually. And some people will really throw their toys out the pram about that, but I mean, really, it becomes an
I'm
issue of
always
contention.
grateful. It can be like.
After years of reporting, I was always 99% of the time the copy editor's right.
Yeah.
99,
yeah.
and you know.
Yeah. When I first started working with graduate students in all fields on their writing, I was often asked, is there one problem that you see that crosses disciplines? And overwhelmingly, it was the case that people were not reading their own work enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was precisely that thing when you're a graduate student where you write the paper, it wasn't under ideal circumstances, it wasn't during the period of time that you had in mind, and the only way to get over it is basically to pretend it was never written and like run away as fast as you can.
Yeah. Oh, really? I mean, I can really sympathize with that position. And then there is something, I will edit other people's work. And you know, after years of doing it, I think I'm okay at it. I can do a decent job. My own work, I just miss stuff. Like, because got this kind of revolted relationship with it, where I just don't really kind of want to. I mean, one of the actual subjects of my thesis was Nabokov's revision of his own work in translation in America. And I started reading about Henry James and the New York edition.
I was just about to say Henry James.
You know, and there's this great Henry James scholar, Philip Horn, who talks about how dogs don't return to their own vomit. Yeah. And how, you know, Henry James going back and just
in the introduction, Princess Casamassima,
doing all this kind of huge, you know, revision to his own, and then getting really grumpy in his letters when people didn't appreciate, you know, all the fine distinctions that he'd made in his own prose.
Figure in the carpet, and he's the monster. He's the figure in the carpet. So as it stands now, you have the 2 books and the reviews. You mentioned very briefly, we were talking about screenplay writing before we actually started formally talking. Are there different kinds of writing that you want to add to your repertoire?
I'm happy to try kind of anything except fiction. Yeah. I don't think I'm very good at writing fiction. Never have been. So no, I think, I don't know. There's a degree to which you kind of, there's a degree to which we find writing in these different genres intimidating, especially if we've come up through the academy. And sometimes it's actually, you need this realization that other people are doing it, and sometimes not really that great. So why not? And okay, it's simplistic to think that the idea of being good at it is actually going to count for that much, and that so much of this is about networks and knowing people and all this sort of stuff. But at some stage, you will be actually judged on whether your work is going to reach a wider audience. Well, and getting to that position can be tricky. So finding the agent or persuading them they're credible. I mean, those processes can often involve kind of social connections and who you know and who you don't. And it is a kind of an exclusive, nepotistic world to inhabit in many ways. But at some stage, it's actually also got to be stuff that people are going to want to read. Sure.
And the inescapable dilemma of the writer, absent readers. In terms of nepotism and the small world of publishing, there's this wonderful passage by Faulkner that I'm sure you know, and he said at some point he felt that a wall had descended between him and all publishers in the world, and then he was able to sit down and write. Yeah. Have you ever had a comparable moment to that? Or
No.
No.
I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to sort of post 2008 without wanting to make so much about the historical moment. But since then, in certainly in the UK, in the newspaper industry, in the publishing industry, everything has got so much tighter, so much more intense. And the world, I mean, I've read extensively through my research about, because my PhD was about Nabokov and his relationship with his publishers. I've read about what publishers used to be like. It was not a particularly onerous job, and it sounded like quite a lot of fun. And they had big budgets, and they could. But these days, it's like any other business. It's a churn, and so the idea of sort of Faulkner having the publishing world open to him and go up to New York and maybe go and have a cocktail with, you know, the guy from Scribner and then the guy from Simon
like
and
Maxwell
Schuster.
Perkins
And then, you know, that stuff. You know, I think if you're amongst the very elite of writers, maybe that sort of stuff still happens. But otherwise, it's just like deadline and delivery and get this out, and we'll see if it hangs. And I don't know.
If you could go back and speak to your graduate student self, and with all that you've learned about writing for different audiences, and you could give some, you know, short, useful advice to your younger self, what would it be?
Less booze, less PlayStation. No, I think like actually to read stuff outside of your very specific. Like I wish I'd read more stuff outside of my specific field. There was just good scholarship.
Yeah.
Like just read, like. Find who people are doing kind of cool, interesting things. Just read them and be sort of attentive to the way that they do that scholarship.
Yes.
I was very obsessed with, you know, the dotting the I's and crossing the T's, you know, and all that stuff within my own very kind of narrow field of interest. I wish I'd been a bit broader.
Yeah.
And that also shows you is a great example. And I came to that late, and when I realised that I could use these other people to model
That's right.
what I was going to do with Nabokov's work. Suddenly it was, you know, the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized I was really liberated by that, because before that I was very narrow, really. And to just also to be a little bit more ambitious in what you want to do, and not be too constrained by hierarchies of the field, or even within the university structure itself. It's such a hierarchical structure. And then sometimes you realize the person that's been telling you that you can't do this and you can't do that hasn't published anything in 15 years.
Well, exactly.
And has been, you know, and you know, their main contribution has been to kind of, you know, keeping alive the sherry economy in kind of Middle England. So it's, yeah, you're kind of a little bit, and it's more structured here, but you are a little bit on your own when you're a grad student, and you just got to just embrace that and go for it, because no one else is gonna do it for you.
It's true. It's true. Unless you make an appointment with me.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So any questions or answers about sports writing or writing? I know there actually is a sports writer in the audience here.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Who's a sports writer?
Well, yeah, I did. I had something similar. Not after my graduate school, but after undergraduate, I was a sports writer and also an English teacher for a couple of years before going back into graduate school, literature field. So, but what you said is absolutely right. That idea of just cutting out. I did the same sort of thing. I had this kind of florid language with lots of adjectives, and it was just cutting it down to its basic syntax. But one thing that conversation was interesting to me, because I was thinking about the fact that, you know, when you're doing that type of writing, you're on a very tight deadline. You have to write quickly. You have to write efficient sentences. But one of the issues with graduate school maybe is that you have these ideas that take years to develop, and which is maybe one of the reasons why the book is so much better than the PhD. It takes a long time to fully mature, for these ideas to fully develop. And there's this idea of losing patience because you kind of want to just finish the dissertation. So it's like balancing these two sort of tendencies that are, I'm not sure if there's some sort of happy middle ground, or what lesson can be learned. If there's some sort of loss of patience from doing the other, from doing the sports writing, or if that sort of editing actually helps you in the long run. I don't know, I was just thinking about this sort of tension between the two, having not enough time or having too much time.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I do think there is this kind of, I certainly had that impatience to get the PhD done and get out of that kind of situation, to use a euphemism. I don't know. It's hard because like at the same time I don't really want to ever read any of the sports writing I ever did again, or I'm particularly bothered by anyone else reading it. I wanted to, for the most part, it was either I wanted to write it because it was giving people information about some event, or I was breaking a news story, in which case, you know, it was just moving the news agenda along or whatever, or doing something, sometimes pretty banal, sometimes something you might be quite invested in. But yeah, in terms of that academic maturation, I think a lot of it actually had less to do, for me, with kind of my ideas getting better, more with just like letting go of the fact that it's okay to not really understand Frederick Jameson. It's fine, like nobody else actually does in the room, and I can actually spend some time maybe going back to that and being less anxious about my performance amongst my peers, and more just like, what is it I can do right now, and is there anything I can do quite well? And I've done some archival stuff, and it's like, okay, well, that I can build on that, and then the ideas, started to develop off the back of that. But what sports did you write about?
Mainly actually high school and college sports, but yeah,
like
the idea of
American ones. With the
all of them, yeah,
exactly.
Hockey, basketball. Maybe if I could ask a quick follow-up question before. So one thing that just struck me too is that the field of sports writing, of journalism in general, has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years with blogs and this lack of attention to basic facts that then get put in the story and published on the internet, right? And then you kind of can't take that back, and it's it looks bad after the fact. But I'm kind of appalled, like when I read these. I love still reading sports blogs or whatever, but I'm appalled by just a lack of ability to write a basic sentence now by so many people, especially. And I feel like sports writing still should have some kind of grammatical style to it. It can still be beautiful, even in a efficient form. I don't know. I don't know how you. It's a poorly worded question, but I guess I just wanted to ask about how you feel that things like blogs and internet have affected writing, especially since you've been in multiple fields and multiple genres of writing.
You know what though? I agree with you. I certainly agree with you, and I know it's true. But I also think, okay, I've read some academic articles recently, and even academic books published by pretty prestigious academic presses that like rife with errors. Okay, they're different kind of errors, but they're rife with errors, accidental typos, literals, those sorts of things. But I think it's the death of editing. Like, no one edits anymore at any level. Like, it's so hard to afford the luxury of being a proper editor. In my time as a newspaper writer, it went from my editor, like, who would spend, an hour or two on a piece I'd written and come back and it would just be better at the end of it. He just wanted, is it going to be in on time? And then he'd stick a headline on it, and he'd make sure I hadn't libeled the newspaper, and then he'd send it out. And that was my relationship with Mitch, my editor, and it was a good one. But the same thing goes in, everything's shrunk. So the writer becomes more responsible for what they put out. And so, and it's a model that, people are saying, well, people publish blogs, and people like to read that stuff. That's kind of fine, and the mistakes that get made on a kind of sentence level that might kind of irk you as a reader of sort of English prose, and maybe rightly so, is one thing. But then, like, the errors of fact and the errors of the stuff that starts to get a little bit dubious is a real problem. And I don't know. Having written, like, I've just gone through the editing process with my academic monograph. And the idea of having 2 sets of academic readings and being copy edited and proof edited and stuff, I feel like that's such a luxury. I'm so grateful to it. But not everyone has OUP's resources anymore. So, when I co-edited a sort of collection of essays for Peter Lang, it was us. And if we screwed up, we screwed up, and it was going in. There was no one else was going to help us out. Me and this other graduate student, and that was kind of sobering.
So assuming you're sticking to one subject, you're not trying to decide between Nabokov and sports. On this range between scholarly and popular, I assume that the differences have to do with content and structure and tone, but what is the rubric of those things that makes you choose which audience you are interested in writing for, or how you sit down every day and actually get the words out?
I think I have very little choice in who I'm going to be writing for, right? Like I get told which books I'm going to review, and I guess once I maybe made the choice about what my PhD subject was going to be about, I knew what I was going to be writing. And then I guess I had the choice again about when I started writing the trade book, what was it going to be about? But after you sort of made those decisions, you kind of know the audience that you're going to be writing for. I would say that the kind of the more nuanced decisions you have to make are definitely between like writing for a wider public about, say, literature, which is much closer to what my academic concern is, than like sports writing. Sports writing was almost its own kind of thing, right? And it's kind of why you're conveying information, and I was a reporter as well. I wasn't a sports writer like Norman Mailer thinks. So yeah, the kind of the nuances between that, and my thesis advisor used to call me too journalistic, and sometimes my newspaper editors would call me out for being too academic, and so I'm constantly walking in front of it. But I don't think it's actually that far. I don't think it's that great a distance. If you're doing them in the way that I think they should be done, but I mean that's just me being, yeah.
But it also sounds like you came to each of those things almost from the outside in. That you started with knowing the audience and then wrote the book or the review or the whatever. So say we're on the other side of that, having no connection to publishers or audiences, and we're trying to decide what kind of writer we want to be.
Yeah.
What would your advice be?
It's a tough question.
Assuming that market and money had nothing to do with it.
Money, because that's the thing, they have everything to do with it. Like, and you're never you're always kind of writing with some sort of instrumental purpose, whether it's a book contract or that tenure track job that you think that your writing is kind of getting you somewhere. Very few is in the luxurious position of being like, the pleasure of writing is what drives me, I sit by the banks of the Charles and it just flows out of me, It's just, I need to know why I'm staring into my MacBook screen and crashing this stuff out. I do think, for what it's worth, and I'm not sure necessarily why you listen to me on this, but in terms of academic prose, I do think it's reducing jargon to a minimum and kind of being as direct and communicating so that you can get your idea across. Because your idea is going to definitely be good, and the writing shouldn't really be getting in the way of that. And then actually, that I think narrows the gap. And I think a lot of the anxieties about academic writing are to do with the kind of legacy of the culture wars and all this kind of stuff about actually, I think some kind of slightly false arguments that people make about how you need a sort of specialist language to be able to deal with certain kind of ideas, which is almost borrowed from different disciplines, and that sometimes as people who write in the humanities, and I'm sorry, I'm assuming you write in the humanities, but if you write in the humanities, it's kind of, we can constantly have this disciplinary anxiety where we feel like we need to, in literature certainly we borrow from sociology or we'll borrow from philosophy or we'll borrow to kind of lend intellectual justification to what we do. Economics at the moment, oh my God. And so you get this kind of half-digested jargon that's which intimidates other people within your field, but to people outside it just becomes kind of impenetrable. And to people who are actually in that field, it's
it's amateurish nonsense.
This is ridiculous. Yes. This isn't sociology. This is you're making this up. So I don't know. I think I do think there's a lot of really, really good academic writing out there. I'm sort of suspicious people who trash everything. But, yeah, you've read the stuff, right? There's also, like, terrible stuff that is just... It's tying itself up in knots before we can even get started, and I feel that's a shame. And I think it's a shame when we're like, struggling for our existence in some ways that we're doing that.
Other questions?
What do you think, or maybe both of you think, makes a good reader?
Good reader. Wow. Trying to remember the Wallace Stevens poem about reader poring over the book. I tend to think about reading in a couple of different ways. One is I very selfishly would like to use reading to sort of make a better life for myself. And by that I mean that I find reading a way to instruct myself not only in the infinite possibilities of other people's thoughts, but also in certainly the limitations of my own thought, but also the points where my own thoughts, however limited, connect up with this apparently unlimited sphere of possibility and the dream of contact. And I guess, so some of it is social, some of it is something like self-cultivation, tending toward effort to acquire virtue. Some of it's just pleasure. And some of it is something akin to a tapeworm I have inside of myself that can only be satisfied with books. When I was a child, I would take out about 20 books from the library, and then I would try and pace myself because I didn't want to read them all right away. So I knew I wouldn't be going back to the library for a week, but often I couldn't resist. So basically like 2 days in, I'd be out of supplies, and then panic would set in, frankly. So this kind of devouring.
Sounds like an addiction.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I would say education, and because I love classical philosophy, I don't have a lot of opportunities to sort of walk around in the fashion of peripatetic philosophers and acquire virtue, so I read like as a substitute for that. Education, pleasure, and tapeworm.
Tapeworm.
Yeah.
I think it's like reading is like writing. There's different registers that you bring to it, right? So when I read, as I will on the 77 bus at Mass Ave, like the football news, I will be reading for I want to find out information and absorb it, and at the same time when I'm reading an academic thing, I'll be thinking about argument and trying. I'm not really reading that for a sort of sense of pleasure in the kind of the prose or whatever. Whereas if I guess I was reading Nabokov, I'd be hoping that I'd be enjoying it. That I'd be reading for there is this kind of pleasure, whether it's intellectual or whether it's just. Nabokov himself would talk about like kind of sensuous pleasure. You read with the spine. You have this kind of visceral reaction to kind of good writing. That also. As someone reading the 21st century, it's hard not to think about. That's you can have that. You can read like that from a position of privilege, like Nabokov had. I don't think it necessarily relies. So it necessarily translates to the kind of the way that I particularly enjoy reading, but there is definitely some way that I kind of a certain type of writing that seems to kind of feed my desire for or feed the tapeworm maybe.
As far as the ideal writer, the ideal reader, it's hard not to have recourse to sort of meaningless aphorisms like the ideal reader is open to being changed by what he or she reads. I don't even know that that's true.
I think I got better at reading when I started looking at words that I didn't understand instead of pretending that I did.
Well, I usually keep a piece of paper next to me while I read, and to this day, I write down words that I'm, just a little bit unclear on.
Yeah.
And I will often find one that I need to look up.
Yeah.
And so I keep sort of discovery journals. And I pretty firmly don't believe that reading a great deal makes you a morally better person. No.
That is nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, we're of the same mind on that topic. Yes. Other questions?
There are some pretty well-read Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. You?
Yes, to build on that, I think when you're reading, you're also hearing the rhythm of the words. I was talking with my advisor in my chapter meeting, and he said you'll need to add more musicality to your writing to achieve that style, the polished, learned style. So what do you think about musicality of English language? How is it different from other languages, according to your experience? For example, in comparison with Russian or any other language?
God, my copy editors would kick me around the newsroom if I talked about the musicality. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. For many years of my life, I applied unsuccessfully to teach in expository writing programs. And one of the reasons why I had such a consistent track record of failure, I think, was because of the sample assignment that I would characteristically submit. And honestly, I didn't really want the job. I was sort of testing them to see if everyone would reject this assignment, and it was universally rejected. I still subscribe to it. So the assignment that I came up with, which I think is related, however tangentially, to this question of musicality, was I suggested that you start with a lyric poem, pretty much any lyric poem, and that without switching languages, you translate it into prose. And like fictional prose, like you use characterization, you use setting, you use plot. And then from there, you can translate it into dialogue, you can translate it into, if you know different genres of poetry, you can do epic, you can do mock epic. And one of the reasons why I think constantly translating even within language and translating to other languages is even better is because if you are working as a sculptor, one of the things that you're doing first is if you're making the model for the sculpture out of wax, you're softening up the wax. And for me, this thinking about words as material and messing with them and translating them and seeing musicality in language is a property of a certain sort of pressure that's been applied to the language. And that kind of pressure for me is most readily applied by actually playing with the language. And recognizing the comedy of translation, I think, is akin to a discovery of the musicality of words, because there's something very funny about just how bad translations can be. And as we know very well, yes. And they can have a kind of clumsy musicality to them, just this sort of inadvertent musicality. And in translating one piece of writing into multiple genres and then however many languages you know, the language becomes, and I would surely be beat up by your editors, it becomes more pliable. You can do more things with it. If it's wax, you can mold it more carefully. If it's clay, you can do more things with it. It's if you're thinking about writing as something purposive or as a set of materials, or alternatively as a technology to structure your thought, then it seems that use of the language would have something to do with the sort of what I would call sturdy music.
I mean, reading work out loud. Like if I have, when I've taught expos writing in the past, like asking students to read their work out loud, you always sort of do that assignment and nobody ever does it. And I I tell people to do it and I say it's like the best thing and I never do it. But the idea that actually when you actually do it, sometimes you start to pick stuff up that is harder to pick up on, especially on the computer screen. It's like tough.
The ear is a better editor than the eye.
Yeah, I really find that to be, I think that's definitely true.
And sometimes if you are ever working with a student who is writing in the way that Duncan wrote when he was in graduate school, there's a very easy fix, which is you have the student read the stuff out loud, and then they basically run out of air mid-sentence if things are really bad. I
also think sounds like your advisor's holding you to pretty high standards if he's asking you to write more musical prose. my advisor was like, can you write a chapter?
Yours moved to another continent.
Like yesterday. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah.
Well, her advisor himself writes musical prose, so it's difficult. Also, music, as we know from the fact that if you hear someone singing or if you hear some popular song and you then have it in your head for the rest of the day, has a built-in capacity for contagion, and it's basically built to have orally adhesive properties and stick in your head somehow. And if you can figure out ways to make your language sticky, and there's some that are really, really obvious. I'm ashamed to reveal this seedy technique, but I will often have sort of submerged vowel rhymes in my prose sentences, and you can take things that you would be using if you were writing a poem and actually repurpose them in prose to create particular kinds of effects. Poetry is a much stickier medium than prose for obvious reasons. And I would just say rhyme and rhythm are ridiculously powerful, and you can use them in prose as much as in poetry. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So, as the years go by with just kind of the digital saturation that I think we all experience, I think I'm actually finding myself, my attention span becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And so I guess my question would be, like, as somebody who, has kind of been on both ends of that, probably earlier digital until now, like, is there anything that you can see that would be helpful for writers that are just, all day, like involved with digital media all day? Anything that would help with that? And then also, do you see any opportunities? What are the opportunities you see in kind of digital publishing or digital writing that maybe are different than kind of traditional avenues and agents and print publishing and stuff like that you see?
And maybe I'll ask the second one first. That's all right. Yeah. So now it's really easy to get published anyway. Like to get published. And to have actual readers, to go. I mean, for example, there are some really super respectable places that are happy to take pictures from academics, public books, Los Angeles Review of Books, places like that will take pictures from academics and publish them, and people will read them, but they don't pay any money. Okay, so it's for me, it's whether you want to be doing this professionally or whether you're an academic who also writes. I think both are super valid, but obviously, I mean, I'm a lecturer, I'm not a tenure track academic, so I feel like I'm kind of slightly in between. So I still, like, my writing is still something that I can't really treat as a luxury. It's still part of like my profession.
Right.
And getting gigs where you get paid to write is hard, and harder than it ever has been, I think. Even with digital, because the digital explosion has kind of democratized it in one sense, but at the same time made it harder to make a living out of it. And friends of mine who do try and do that, it's freelancers, it's a tough life. Like,
brutal.
And because there are very few retainers, like, you know, sort of monthly, you know, payments that you can get for writing. There's very few sort of regular gigs, regular columns that you can get. Most, you know, staff writing jobs are far fewer than they used to be. So it's tough. But if you're an academic who has a sort of good salary and you want to kind of get your research out to a wider audience, that's never been easier, I don't think. I think it's really great. In terms of the attention span stuff, and I'm really fascinated by this recent explosion in long form journalism. You know, and it's actually how I'm finding out about it is through Twitter, which is kind of ironic, right? So, like, you know, there's all these Twitter feeds about like long form this, you know, long form that, and it's leading you into these kind of brilliant pieces of journalism that people are doing. And there seems to really be a kind of demand for this. And it's funny, years ago, we just had these endless gurus come in to the office telling us about what we need to do. What we need to do is like chase hits. So, you know, stick Britney Spears in your headline and go for it. And then they realised, no, readers don't care for that. They want to return. So, like, write stuff that's going to make them feel part of a club. And then you realise actually people, you know, just wanted the kind of the information and they didn't want to pay for it, and that was just the thing. So if you had a paywall, you were screwed.
Yeah.
So, but amongst all these people that came in, one person came in and he said, this guy came in and he said, and I don't even remember who he was specifically, but he said, you know, the digital stuff is going to breed all this kind of like immediate demand, but then you're going to get a pushback and people are going to want more substantial stuff. And what you might have is kind of, just as, I mean, I think the analogy used was alcohol, right? So that you could suddenly, like, alcohol was a lot cheaper and more available, but then kind of people are kind of going to get bored of Budweiser and they're going to want these super pretentious, sophisticated IPAs, would be my analogy now using the American market. He used something different, I think, or like cocktails or something like what makes you, you know, that has this kind of whole different register to it. And so this long form stuff, I think, is a direct response to sort of the Twitter, you know, the Twitter kind of way of assimilating news, or the 24-hour, you know, like television news cycle, is that you get these kind of things that really satisfy your desire to kind of understand something in a more sophisticated manner, that actually the sort of the in-betweenness of the sort of regular newspaper article, which its length is dictated by space on the page and advertisement size and all this sort of stuff, column inches, that's kind of become redundant, but the information that people want hasn't. But becoming the person that can write that sort of long-form journalism stuff is still a pretty fraught and difficult thing. Yeah, not easy to get into that world, I don't think.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
It's at some point the enormous corpus of literature on the association between writing and suffering becomes relevant. And there's a seeming almost perversity to the process. You write something that you just tossed off and didn't care about, and that's the thing that people love, and then you slave over something for years and nobody pays any attention. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had a reader's letter for any review I've ever written for the Telegraph. I had one guy accuse me of taking money from a novelist. £35,000 was what he thought I'd taken to write him a good review so he could get on the Booker Prize shortlist. You know what? He got on the Booker Prize shortlist.
Oh my gosh, it's a completely effective scheme. And what did you spend the money on?
Still don't. He still checks in the post. He told me checks in the post. I mean, just complete nonsense. Yeah, I recently found out that this terrible academic article I wrote that was basically my master's thesis. Has been cited a lot in France.
Wow.
So, you know, whatever, you know, what's taken with one hand.
But the good news is, since your last name is White and mine is Smith, like, could be another version. I mean, you know, there's always deniability built in.
There's a really bad sci-fi writer in Brighton called Duncan White. I get mistaken for him sometimes.
There's a realtor in Missouri. Well, this has been truly wonderful, so let's thank Duncan. And I'm going to be holding one of these conversations a month, so if there are people you would like to recommend for this, please let me know. And so hopefully I'll see you next month. Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks,
That was
guys.
great.
Thanks for coming
Thank
on a rainy
you.
night.
Yeah, coming out on a rainy night. That's true. Yeah.